Welcome to Higher Change. I'm Dr. Thomas Luttrell, and our chapter is What is Love? We're talking about interpersonal relationships. Just as attitudes involve emotions, behavior, and cognition, love is more than an emotion. Love involves passion, intimacy, and commitment. Intimacy and secure relationships require a foundation of trust. However, our past experiences and shame can derail close bonds from developing. So in this lesson, we're going to identify factors that are involved in interpersonal attraction. We're going to describe different types of love outlined in Robert Sternberg's triangular theory of love. And we're going to describe attachment theory and how attachment styles affect romantic relationships. So let's start with talking about dating and mate selection. Now, we oftentimes have different terms to describe the progress of our dating relationships. And these terms change frequently throughout the generations. And that's because our patterns of dating also change due to the change in environment. But in general, we have a distinction between informal dating and formal dating. So some people might call the informal stage talking, like we're talking to somebody or talking to each other. So when somebody says they went out on a date, that may mean they are informal or casually dating each other, but they're not exclusive. Whereas when somebody says they are dating, that means they are exclusive and that they are boyfriend and girlfriend. So in general, there is a progression that starts from being casual friends that moves toward increasing exclusivity and commitment. What are some factors that go into why we choose the people we like? Attraction is driven by factors such as physical attractiveness. That's one factor that people oftentimes forget to mention when they're asked about what attracts people. Of course, physical attraction is very important, but what drives that? Many of us are not drop-dead gorgeous or supermodel celebrities, and so we require other things. And that most often times means that our attraction develops through familiarity. We are actually attracted to people when we become more familiar with them. And that occurs through repeated exposure to somebody. How is it that we gain repeated exposure to people? Did you know that the most common places that we meet our mates or our partners are at places that we encounter people the most frequently? And that includes the workplace. For example, a lot of people meet their partners at work. But even more common than that is our schools. So for college students, this means that while they're in school, they have the best opportunity to meet somebody because they're constantly encountering people around them and they're developing familiarity with these people through that repeated contact. I know many people, such as myself, who met their partner while at college. Outside of college, if people don't meet their partners in school, then they are really dependent on finding their partner at work or at a club or bar or at church. Unfortunately, at the club or at church, the options tend to be fewer. And sometimes you're not really going to be satisfied with your selection pool there. So that's why it's important for people to take advantage of the opportunities while they're still in school to meet people. Otherwise, it gets a little harder. Now, proximity means that we oftentimes mate with the people who are closest to us, whether it's physical or geographical nearness, as well as the exposure to that person. So proximity is important. You may want to meet somebody who is living in California, but or on the other side of the country from you. Let's say you live on the East Coast and the person you want to meet is on the West Coast, or vice versa. You're living on the West Coast and that sort of thing. Well, it's going to be very hard if that person lives hours away by an airplane. What is the chances that you're ever going to meet that person? And if you do meet that person, what are the chances that you're going to fall in love enough to be able to meet, be able to stay with that person? So the likelihood is that we're more likely going to fall in love with somebody who we encounter on a daily basis. Now, another factor that also plays a role is similarity and complementarity. Now, if I was to ask you which is more effective in our dating relationships, which one would you say? Would you say it's opposites attract or birds of a feather flock together? Most people would say opposites attract. It's very common belief. However, the research shows that we tend to be attracted to people who are most like us. We tend to be drawn to people who have similar values, similar religious values or political views. We tend to be drawn to people who are of the same race or of the same social class and so forth. And so we tend to mate with people who are similar to us. Now, as far as complementarity, yeah, we do like people who are somewhat different, but those are in specific areas. For example, some people might prefer somebody who complements them in terms of extroversion or introversion. Maybe somebody who's more outgoing, somebody who's not as outgoing, and vice versa. The last factor that is involved in our attraction is we like people who like us. So that's reciprocity of liking. We like people who like us. Now, unfortunately, sometimes we misread cues and we might like somebody because we think they like us back. But then we might find out that that it's not correct or we're mistaken. And so sometimes people are hurt by that. But we oftentimes like people as soon as we think that they might like us back. Now, social networking and online friendships are rewriting the rules of the game. And increasingly, we have different patterns of dating due to the changes in technology. So, for example, mobile apps are now getting involved in our dating lives as well. Let's talk about loving, intimate relationships now. Primary relationships have a great influence on our emotions. So these include not just our romantic relationships, but also our family relationships, like between parents and children, between siblings, and between our loved ones. And if you think about all the times you've been hurt or you've had strong emotions, almost always, probably the vast majority of times, these are due to changes in our relationships. So that really stresses the importance of human love. Why is it important? There's a story of King Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor who lived in 1194 to 1250 AD. He was the dynasty of the German kings during the Middle Ages. And according to a Franciscan monk, some Limbe, Frederick II conducted brutal and deadly human experiments. One of his experiments involved raising infants. What do you think happened to these infants? So he had nurses essentially raise these infants, but they only bathed them and fed them. They didn't talk to them and they didn't touch them. What do you think happened to them? Well, unfortunately, they had failure to thrive, or essentially they all died, which is really sad, of course, and hopefully we would never do something like that in modern times, an experiment on humans like that. But it does raise the importance of why we need human relationships for our survival. Relationships often provide an important motivation for people to take care of their health. Poor relationships, breakups, and divorce can add stress, which can harm one's health. And loneliness can be more dangerous than smoking. Did you know that? Even more dangerous than smoking is loneliness. So this really shows that relationships are crucial for our health, not just mental health, but our physical health as well. So that reminds me of a passage in the Bible. I used to think that our need for relationships meant that we were weak or codependent. But then I came across this passage that really affirmed our common need. And that is Genesis 2:18. It says, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.'" I remember talking to a woman who was in a rehab and she said, "Oh, I'm so codependent." And I asked her, "Well, what makes you think you're codependent?" And she said, "Well, my counselor told me." And I said, "Well, why did your counselor think you're codependent?" And she said, "Well, because I really miss my husband," because she was in this rehab and she wasn't able to see her husband. Now, I told her, "No, you're not codependent because of that. that doesn't make you codependent. All of us need relationships, and when we are gone from our loved ones, of course we're going to miss them. That's normal. That's normal human behavior. That doesn't make one codependent. So it's important. Our relationships are important to us and to our health. A strong affection for another person due to kinship, personal ties, sexual attraction, admiration, or common interest is called love. But let's talk more about that. So this is a strong affection, but it's a little more deeper than the common definition might imply. For example, why is love not listed as one of the typical emotions when we think about emotions? For example, in the movie Inside Out, the cast of characters did not include love. Why? So what is love? If you recall the ABCs of behavior, there are 3 components that go beyond just emotion. There's affect or arousal, there's behavioral aspects, and then there's cognitive aspect. The same thing can apply to love. For example, we're going to look at some theories of romantic love. The first theory is Robert Steinberg's triangular theory of love, and he defined love as having 3 components. Let's take a look at those. We're going to look at that. And many forms of love are possible, reflecting different balances of these 3 components. So those 3 components are passion, commitment, and intimacy. So if you recall the ABCs, which one would be the affective, which one would be the behavioral, and which one would be the cognitive component? Well, passion is easily identified as the affective or emotional component. The other 2 is not quite clear. Here's what I would suggest. I would say commitment is the behavioral component and intimacies related to the cognitive component. And why would I say that? Well, what is intimacy anyway, first of all? Intimacy, which we're going to talk about in a minute, has more to do with that understanding, the cognitive knowledge. Now, if I was to ask you which of these is the most important, this would be challenging for people because many people have different opinions. But look at it. Let's take a look. What would happen if you didn't have the other 3? If you only had intimacy, then you would simply have a liking of that person. And that would be it. You like the person and that's it. If you had just intimacy and passion, yeah, you might have romantic love, but you're just falling in love and there's no commitment. If you had passion only, then that's basically just infatuation. There's no intimacy. You don't really know the person, and there's no commitment. You just are passionate about the person. That's infatuation. A fatuous love is basically where you have passion and commitment, but you don't really know the person. So this is a relationship that's fast and furious. People who dive into the relationship after only a couple weeks of knowing each other, they may have passion and they may even have commitment, but they don't really know each other. So that's fatuous. A commitment-only relationship is an empty love. They may have commitment to the institution marriage, but they don't have much else. Then there's a companionate love. A companionate love means they are good companions. They have intimacy and they may even have commitment like a family member, but they don't have the passion like in the romantic sense. So they're just companions. They may live together and be good roommates, but they're just companions. Now, all 3 of these combined would be a consummate love. Consummate means that it's a fulfillment of something. And so that's consummating in all areas of this love. So some examples, like I said, their romantic love is intimacy with passion. Companion love is intimacy with commitment. And consummate love contains all 3 of these. So let's talk about intimacy. I was starting to talk about that earlier, but I want to talk more about that. What is intimacy? I mentioned that it's a cognitive component, but why? Intimacy involves closeness with another person in a family-like connection. This develops as you share your life stories, secrets, and dreams. So when you have intimacy, you're closely acquainted or very familiar with each other. That's the definition. And it comes from the Latin intimare, which means to make familiar, which comes from intimus, or our innermost aspects of ourselves. So we really get to know all parts of each other when we have intimacy. And intimacy involves a deep encounter between two people. It's a close personal relationship with a deep knowledge or understanding of each other. And this includes many different aspects of ourselves. It includes our emotions, our finances, our physical aspects, our intellect, our recreational interests, and our spirituality. When we really know each other, we know everything about each other, not just one area. And so sexuality is oftentimes just the tip of the iceberg. It reminds me in the Bible, Genesis 4:1, it says that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. It's interesting that that word knew is used for their sexual relationship, but it literally means to know or be intimate with each other. And knowledge of each other really is is intimacy in a holistic sense. You really know everything about each other. In the same way, God knows us. In fact, the Bible uses the same word in the Hebrew to talk about how God knows us, yadas us. And Jesus says in Matthew 10 that God knows how many hairs are on our head. Wow, God knows us intimately. So that's what intimacy really is about. It's knowledge of each other. Now, there's some obstacles that can get in the way of intimacy. Let's talk about that. What are some obstacles that you can think of for why people have difficulty having intimacy between each other? Maybe our past experiences, maybe some walls that we've built up, but a lot of times it has to do with our past. Now, there is a biological side of us I want to mention. We have a social brain. And social neuroscience looks at how biology can influence social behavior. So hormones such as testosterone can cause aggression. So if you have too much testosterone, you can be very aggressive. Whereas oxytocin is a hormone responsible for attachment bonding. We're going to talk about that more in a second. But oxytocin is the love hormone. And lastly, the firing of mirror neurons when we observe others helps us to imitate them and plays a role in empathy and understanding other people's behavior. So that's mirror neurons. If we have problems in these areas, it can also inhibit our relationships. But that's just the biological side. Let's look at it psychologically. I want to talk about attachment theory next. John Bowlby lived in 1907 to 1990, and he was a British child psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He developed attachment theory. He said the propensity to make strong emotional bonds to particular individuals is a basic component of human nature. So Bowlby proposed a view that acknowledges the interaction of biology and social forces in the development of attachment. So for example, the formation of strong bonds or attachment starts with a mother and child. You might think of a mother breastfeeding her child. The breastfeeding actually releases oxytocin, a hormone or neurotransmitter that is important for bonding and attachment. So as I said, there's that biological side, but it's also social as well. Attachment keeps the infant close to the mother, which is critical for the child's survival. As we said, relationships are very important, and that attachment bond is what helps keep that relationship strong. Becoming attached to parents, which usually occurs by age 8 or 9 months, is the most influential social relationship that infants can establish. In Bowlby's evolutionary view, secure attachment depends on the development of synchrony, which is a continuous back and forth interaction between infants and their caregivers. When caregivers are responsive, stronger attachment results. On the other hand, if a parent neglects you, then you start to think that perhaps there's something wrong with you, or perhaps other people are unreliable. And this can carry forward into our adult relationships as well. So there are two benefits of a secure attachment. First, it provides a secure base from which we can feel safe to explore our world. So if you think about a parent and child, when there's a secure relationship, the child can feel like they can explore the world, they can learn to walk or crawl, because they know that if they ever get stuck, they have a base that they can move back to. If you think about a secure base in the military sense, it's a forward operating base, which just allows us to explore and move forward from. That's what a secure base is. On the other hand, a secure attachment also provides us a safe haven. So when we have problems, we can feel safe to return to somebody, and they provide that safe haven, somebody we can go to when we need help. Now, Bowlby believed that early bonds that form between children and their caregivers have a lifelong impact. Securely attached people can recognize and regulate their emotions better. So that's because, like I said, they know that they are worth something, and that they know other people are reliable. And so when they do have problems, they're able to self-soothe. That is a benefit of secure attachments. So those with secure attachments also have no or less shame. And so they have a good sense of themselves. And a positive sense of self is important for good relationships. If you think about it this way, if you have a positive sense of self-worth, you're more likely to assert your needs and get those needs met. And you're more likely to collaboratively solve problems with other people. In other words, you're not going to just be passive because you feel like your needs are valuable. On the other hand, you don't feel the need to be aggressive about your needs because you trust that other people are going to work with you. And so that creates happy and secure relationship attachments, not just romantic, but also family relationships as well. And when we have happy and secure relationships, that reinforces a positive sense of self and self-worth. Unfortunately, shame and insecure attachments oftentimes derail our relationships. If you think about many stories about couples, oftentimes couples start out romantic and happy in love, right? But then we think about 40% of all relationships end in divorce. Why? Why is it that so many couples look like they're perfect together on their wedding day, and yet a few years later they fall apart? Well, it really comes back to the dance of insecure attachments that oftentimes start in our childhood. So Mary Ainsworth sought to explore the development of our attachments, or our style of attaching. And so she developed the strange situation test. So this is Ainsworth's strange situation test, where mothers left their 12 to 18-month-old toddlers in a room with toys and a stranger. And so the mother would leave and come back. And how the child responded was analyzed. And so she developed different styles of relating to caregivers based on this situation test. So most of the children had a secure attachment, meaning they had a strong emotional bond with their caregiver that develops because of responsive caregiving. Now, to be clear, they would cry if the mother left. That was normal. But what they found was that when the child came back, they would be calm, and they would be soothed, and they could resume a normal relationship with their parents. On the other hand, the remainder of the toddlers displayed insecure attachment, and this was demonstrated by when the mother returned, they would demonstrate obsessive clinging, or they would be really mad at their parent, or they would turn and look the other way and pretend the parent wasn't there. And so Ainsworth believed that this is a result of inconsistent or unresponsive caregiving. So insecure attachments are the result of inconsistent or unresponsive caregiving. So this is a broad spectrum. There's secure versus insecure attachment, but we can further divide this into 4 quadrants, which we're going to look at. But according to attachment theory, attachments formed in infancy are the basis for relationships throughout life. And although this claim appears to be overstated, studies continue to verify this. So what is your attachment style? There's 2 dimensions that we might think of. There's the dimension of anxiety, and there's a dimension of avoidance. So, for example, with the children whose mother came and left, or left and came back, they might demonstrate anxiety that would be shown by clinging or fearful response. On the other hand, they might also demonstrate avoidance. And so they might look the other way and pretend the parent isn't there. And we do the same things in our romantic adult relationships. I like to think of us as all being divided into 2 categories, generally speaking. We can be either cats or dogs. If you think about pets, the cats and dogs as pets, what are they like and how are they different? I'm going to put up a chart that's going to show the difference between the two styles. Cats tend to be overly independent, even avoiding intimacy. They manage stress by withdrawing from others, and they're more distant from each other. They tend to look critical of others, and they're self-sufficient, but they're somewhat defensive. In other words, they want affection, but on their terms. Dogs, on the other hand, if you think about dogs, they're more likely to bark when their owner leaves and bark when they come back. And they're likely to jump at the door and pounce on the door when they see the potential or the possibility of the owner even showing up. So dogs seek high level of intimacy, approval, and responsiveness. They tend to be more overly dependent, more clingy. They tend to be controlling of others. They're emotionally expressive, very expressive, and they have a less positive view about themselves. So we tend to be either of these extremes. We tend to be either cats or dogs, or both. So if we look at it in a quadrant, we might think of ourselves as all being on one of four styles. Now, obviously, in the top left of this chart, there's a secure attachment. And these people have a positive sense of self, and they have a positive sense of others, meaning they think good thoughts about themselves, but they also trust others as being reliable. On the other hand, a dog is going to be more anxious and clingy in the relationship or codependent because they have a negative view about themselves, but a positive view about other people. On the flip side, cats are dismissing and avoidant of intimacy, and that's because they may have a positive view about themselves, but they have a negative view about others, so they keep other people at a distance. And lastly, some people will have a combination. They're fearful of intimacy. They may be even socially avoidant. And these people have negative thoughts about themselves, and they have negative thoughts about others. And these people, unfortunately, are oftentimes victims of abuse because they, on one hand, feel dependent on other people, but those other people are unreliable and unsafe. So they have a constant love-hate relationship. So that is they're fearful of intimacy. So what is your attachment style? You can actually measure that using the Experiences in Close Relationships assessment, which I oftentimes provide my students as a self-assessment. Now, people with a secure attachment are able to better cope with life stressors. They have a positive self-esteem. On the other hand, people who have a negative sense of self, whether they're dogs or they have a mixture of both, these people have a lot of shame about themselves. And if you ask them and you measure their shame, that shame would be pretty obvious. On the other hand, people who are avoidant, they may actually have positive views about themselves and negative views about other people. But I would say they do experience shame, and that shame typically is more invisible and it's oftentimes suppressed because it's really about how other people are unreliable, which says something about who they are. But deep down inside, they tend to avoid or disconnect from those emotions, and so they have more of a pseudo-self. So it's interesting, if you think about dogs and cats, how they oftentimes relate to each other, dogs oftentimes chase cats around. And so if you think about in romantic relationships, people who are more anxious, they're going to pursue a connection, and they may oftentimes pursue connections with cats who are avoiding the relationship. And really what they're avoiding, the cats really are avoiding conflict. So you might find yourself in this pursue-withdrawal relationship, which is very common in romantic relationships. Now you may also find other combinations like two cats where they're mutually avoidant, or two dogs where they're both pursuing each other and they're very enmeshed. But this one is a very common pattern, a pursue-withdrawal relationship. Now over time, that person who is the cat, who is avoiding conflict, may check out and turn to a third person or substance to help them manage that stress. What do you think happens to the pursuer? Usually that person also checks out and turns away, and also may turn to other people or a substance. And that's usually when the relationship deteriorates. Now, unfortunately, Our relationships also oftentimes have inequality between men and women. And that's an unfortunate aspect of the gender differences and the socialized differences between men and women in our world. Men and women very often reveal shame differently. For example, men tend to project their shame onto other people and they tend to project hostility onto other people, whereas women tend to internalize their shame and make it about themselves. So, if that's the case, then you can see how this could actually set up one partner to be more valued than the other person. If one person is shaming themselves, then they're more likely to take a one down position and see themselves as inferior. So, unfortunately, men tend to have a lot of power in relationships. And I see this a lot. Unfortunately, due to the power that men hold in society, men still tend to dominate in their relationships. And inequality can unfortunately have a negative effect on women. If I was to ask men and women who gets the benefit, who is benefiting from a relationship, almost always the male is the one who benefits more from a relationship than the female. Women are more likely to have cost associated with a relationship. So as I mentioned before, I talked before about abuse of power and control. I will just talk about it briefly here again. There are ways, unfortunately, that people maintain power and control in their relationship. I'll just talk about this briefly. People use intimidation. People emotionally abuse their partner. Sometimes they use their finances to exploit their partner, financial abuse. Then sometimes they try to isolate their partner from other people, so that's isolation. Then they may minimize or deny the other person's concerns. They may use children and pets as pawns to control the other person. And they may assert privilege. A man might say, "Well, I'm the head of the house, therefore you should do what I say." And lastly, some people use coercion and threats to control people. And this is the Duluth model that is used in domestic violence treatment. Now, John Gottman writes about the effects of power on relationships. And he found, ironically, in one of his more recent books, he wrote the book, The Science of Trust. And he found that we talk a lot about the importance of attunement and couples having greater intimacy. But what he found was that power inequality disrupts intimacy because it disrupts trust. And when there's a lack of trust, it takes away that foundation which is necessary for the development of intimacy. It's hard to trust somebody when they have more power over you. That's what he found. So if people want to develop trust, they have to have a sense of equality in the relationship. So equality is very important for couples to be happy. So equality involves emotional intimacy, quality time and affection, respect, trust, open communication, economic partnership, social support, accountability, shared responsibilities, and fairness or mutual negotiation. So relationships are very important for our health. And so some things you can do. There are 4 things that I like to encourage people to do to have a healthy relationship. And there are 4 A's. The first A is awareness, or listening to oneself and the other. It's important to be mindful and aware of each other and oneself so they can have a healthy relationship. The second A is acceptance, or unconditionally forgiving of flaws. Now, what this doesn't mean is it doesn't mean overlooking the person's flaws, especially when someone's dating the person. If you're dating somebody, you should have conditional, it should be conditioned. But when you're in a romantic relationship and you want it to be successful, you may find it helpful to, while holding on to those expectations, you may also find it helpful to set it aside too. So acceptance does not mean endorsement. Let's be clear about that. Acceptance doesn't mean you like it. Forgiveness implies that if someone's doing something wrong, then they're doing something wrong. But forgiveness doesn't mean you are endorsing it or that you're saying it's okay. It just means it is what it is. And you will do what you need to do to protect yourself, of course. But you also recognize that the person may or may not change. The third thing is appreciation. And this involves gratitude for the positive qualities in yourself and other people. Once you realize that people are human beings and they make mistakes, it makes it easier to appreciate them. Again, it doesn't mean ignoring or tolerating abuse or mistakes. In fact, it's because of that when we recognize that we have a right to our boundaries, then we can forgive, then we can choose to forgive that person. But it also means that we see the person as a human being who makes mistakes. And when we do that, we find ways to appreciate the person in all their humanness. They may make mistakes, but we also look at the strengths as well. And the last A is respectful assertiveness, meaning that you assert your needs and you recognize the equality of the other person as well, and that both people have equal relational worth. So assertiveness doesn't mean you're dominating, it just means that you're negotiating and you're getting your needs met as well. So I just want to mention a spiritual view of love really quickly. As I mentioned, the Bible says it is not good for a man to be alone. The Bible really is affirming of our romantic relationships. And I would like to think that our relationships reflect the image of God. The Bible says that we are created in the image of God. So Genesis 1:27 says, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. If you think about why did God go through all the trouble to create men and women? I like to think that God is a diverse God, first of all, and is a relational God. He's able to find unity in diversity. And we reflect God's love when we are united. And we're created to reflect God's love in our relationships. And even if that image of God is distorted by sin, it's still there. And I like to look at that positive quality in humans. We all have that capacity for love. Also, Genesis 2 gives us a picture of that first marriage. God took the rib from Adam and created a woman out of Adam's rib. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And that is why a man leaves his father and mother, and he's united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. This is a really good passage because it helps us to know that there's nothing dirty or wrong with sexuality. God created us to have sexuality. And we don't have to feel ashamed. Adam and Eve were naked together and they felt no shame. And so they were able to have intimacy without that shame. As you can see, shame is the interference for intimacy. That's why it's so important to talk about how shame affects us. So you can see this pattern that's spelled out. We leave our parents, we cleave to our partner, we become one flesh. We can have they could be naked without being ashamed. And then in Genesis 4, it says Adam knew Eve. And remember, knew, that knowledge represents intimacy in the fullest sense. Now, I like to think that marriage reflects the image of God. If we think about marriage, why did God go through all the trouble to create marriage? God is a relational God, a loving God who loves us unconditionally. We don't have to experience shame because we can stand before God completely naked in every sense, and then God, there's nothing to be embarrassed about because God knows everything about us. And at the same time, there can be differences, and yet we can be united. Some people believe in the Trinity, and so if you think about it that way, there's different personalities, aspects of God, and yet they can be united. And God created us for pleasure and delight. God is not a stoic God who hates pleasure, but rather he created us for pleasure. And he's not unselfish. He wants to give away love. And lastly, he wants an exclusive relationship with us as well, just as marriage is designed to be exclusive between two partners. Unfortunately, as I said, shame gets in the way, and that's the way Satan or the devil attacks our intimacy. If you recall in Genesis 3, the devil tempted Adam and Eve. And it really teaches us about how Satan attacks our hearts and our intimate relationships. And as a result of the fall, it introduced shame, blame, and separation into our relationships. And as a result, God cursed us. And he said, speaking to Eve, he said, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And here you can see that inequality that was introduced as a result of the fall. Now, I like to think because of this, that it means that God created us to be equal and that inequality wasn't a part of God's original plan. And lastly, I want to end on this passage. What does it mean to really love each other? Is it about getting our way or bullying each other or dominating the other person or asserting our authority? No. If we think about love in this sense, if you remember the triangular theory of love, there's that commitment. Well, the Bible also talks about agape love. Agape love is this unconditional love that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13. This is a classic text that is quoted at many weddings. And so let's read it. Paul writes, "Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails." If you think about it, the word agape is also translated in some passages as charity. And charity is like a gift. And so this kind of love is unconditional. It involves looking past each other's flaws and appreciating the other person's worth. We do not, it is a gift that we give to the other person, this gift of appreciation. We don't hold it back because of because of some criticism that we have, but rather we have charitable views of the other person. We're gracious toward each other. How many relationships could use some grace, to be honest? Many families need some grace, and that's really what love is. And it needs grace to really be this agape love in the fullest sense. And so I really like this quote. This is what Ellen White talks about with regard to love, in contrast to the dominating that some people try to use. Ellen White says that love is power. Intellectual and moral strength are involved in this principle and cannot be separated from it. The power of wealth has a tendency to corrupt and destroy. The power of force is strong to do hurt. But the excellence and value of pure love consists in its efficiency to do good and to do nothing else than good. I hope you can join us for our next chapter as we talk about sex. We're going to specifically focus on sexual behavior, sexual identity,